a corporation more powerful than governments, a logo more feared than any flag, a fruit company that could pick up the phone and have entire presidents removed. This sounds like dystopian fiction. It's not. For half a century, one American company owned more land in Central America than most Central Americans. It controlled their railroads. It ran their ports. It paid their politicians. And when a country tried to take back its sovereignty, the company didn't sue, it overthrew them. The United Fruit Company didn't just sell bananas. It engineered nations. And the blueprint it created, turning economic power into political control, didn't disappear. It evolved. This is the story of how a fruit became a weapon, and why the tactics that worked in 1954 Guatemala are still working today. Here's the part nobody explains. Why bananas? Oil makes sense. Oil runs machines, fuels militaries, powers economies. Gold makes sense. It's literal wealth. Even coffee or cotton had strategic value. But bananas? A fruit that rots in a week. That's exactly why they became valuable. Because controlling something fragile means controlling the entire supply chain. And controlling the supply chain means controlling the country that grows it. The genius of the banana business wasn't the fruit. It was the infrastructure required to move it. You needed plantations, sure. But you also needed railroads to the coast, refrigerated ships to transport, ports to load, and governments that would never ever interfere. United Fruit didn't just grow bananas. It built the entire system and then made nations dependent on it. The fruit was the product. The control was the business model. Let's go back to 1899. United Fruit Company formed by merging several smaller operations. It quickly becomes something unprecedented, a corporation that functions like a government. By the 1920s, UFCO owned more land than anyone else in Central America. Not more farmland, more land, period. Hundreds of thousands of acres in Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Colombia. But here's the trick. Most of that land wasn't even being farmed. United Fruit kept it idle deliberately. Why? Competition. If you own all the good land, nobody else can grow bananas. If nobody else can grow bananas, you control the market. And if you control the market, you control prices. Governments couldn't tax what wasn't being used. But UFCO could threaten to abandon operations if taxes ever rose. The company held entire national budgets hostage with land it deliberately left empty. Then came the railroads. Central America's first rail networks weren't built to connect cities or help people travel. They were built by United Fruit to move bananas from plantations to ports. That's why even today, rail lines in these countries run in strange patterns through jungles, avoiding population centers, skipping major towns. They weren't infrastructure. They were corporate conveyor belts. And because UFCO built them, it controlled them. If a government tried to regulate the company, UFCO could shut down the railroads. No rails meant no exports. No exports meant economic collapse. The company didn't need an army. It had leverage. But the real control happened at ground level, in the company towns. Imagine this. You're a worker in Guatemala, 1930s. You live in a house owned by United Fruit. You shop at a store owned by United Fruit. Your children go to a school run by United Fruit. You're paid in company scrip, basically monopoly money that you can only spend at company stores, where prices are set by the company. You don't get wages in real currency. You get debt in a closed loop. If you complain, you're fired. If you're fired, you're evicted. If you're evicted, you have nowhere to go because UFCO owns all the nearby land. And if you organize with other workers to strike, the company doesn't just fire you, it calls in the government. In 1928, Colombian workers struck for better wages and safer conditions. United Fruit requested military intervention. The government complied. Troops opened fire on thousands of strikers in what became known as the Banana Massacre. Official death toll, 9. Witnesses said it was hundreds, possibly over 1,000. The company called it restoring order. The workers called it execution. and the government dependent on banana export taxes called it necessary. This wasn't capitalism. This was feudalism with a corporate logo. United Fruit understood something crucial. In weak democracies, money buys more than products, it buys policy. The company funded political campaigns. It offered politicians lucrative deals. It lobbied for tax exemptions, land concessions, labor suppression. And when leaders didn't cooperate, UFCO had a backup plan: the United States government. Here's how it worked. When workers demanded rights, UFCO called it labor unrest. When governments proposed taxes, it became hostile to American business. And when a president tried to reclaim unused land, it was labeled communist. During the Cold War, that last one was magic. Just whisper communism, and the U.S. government would treat your corporate dispute as a national security crisis. UFCO spent millions on propaganda campaigns. It hired PR firms to plant stories in American newspapers about red infiltration in Central America. It created the narrative that any reform threatening its profits was Soviet expansion. And because United Fruit executives had personal connections to top U.S. official Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had worked for UFCO's law firm. His brother Allen Dulles, CIA director, sat on UFCO's board. The company's interests became America's interests. Corporate lobbying became foreign policy. And foreign policy became regime change. In 1951, Guatemala elected Jacobo Arbenz as president. He was a reformer, a nationalist, and he had one major platform: land redistribution. The problem was simple. 2% of landowners held 70% of Guatemala's land. United Fruit alone owned 550,000 acres and was actively farming only 15% of it. The rest sat idle while Guatemalans starved. Arbenz proposed a law. Any unused land over a certain size will be purchased by the government at the value the owner declared for taxes. That compensation would be paid, and the land redistributed to farmers. For most companies, this would mean negotiation. For United Fruit, it was war. UFCO had valued its land at around $3 per acre for tax purposes. So Arbenz offered compensation at $3 per acre, the company's own valuation. United Fruit responded with outrage. Apparently, the land was worthless when being taxed, but priceless when being taken. The company launched a massive lobbying campaign in Washington. It hired journalists to write about communist takeover in Guatemala. It funded propaganda portraying Arbenz as a Soviet puppet, despite zero evidence. In 1954, the CIA launched Operation PEPSUX. It armed a small force of exiles, created fake radio broadcasts claiming mass military defections, and bribed Guatemalan officers. The actual rebel force numbered only a few hundred, but the psychological operation worked. Arbenz, believing his military had turned against him, resigned. A military dictatorship took over, reversed land reform, and protected United Fruit's holdings. Within years, Guatemala descended into a civil war that would last 36 years and kill over 200,000 people. United Fruit's response? Business as usual. A democratically elected government had been toppled to protect the corporation's unused land. And in Washington, this wasn't framed as corporate interference. It was celebrated as stopping communism. Profit disguised as patriotism. That was the magic trick. United Fruit's power eventually declined. Antitrust pressure, bad publicity, corporate restructuring. It rebranded as Chiquita in the 1990s, but the playbook didn't die. It adapted. Today, corporations don't need private armies to influence governments. They use trade agreements that override local laws. They threaten to move factories if labor standards rise. They fund political campaigns through dark money networks. Tech giants shape national policy on speech and privacy. Pharmaceutical companies write healthcare legislation. Energy companies influence climate policy. The tools have evolved. The logic hasn't. And in developing countries, the pattern is even clearer. International corporations still control supply chains that determine national economies. They still leverage infrastructure investments for political concessions. They still frame regulation as hostile to business. The difference is we no longer call them banana republics. We call them emerging markets. So, what's the lesson? The United Fruit Company didn't break Latin America because it grew bananas. It broke Latin America because it turned economic dependency into political control. And it succeeded because no one stopped it until millions had already suffered. The warning isn't about fruit. It's about what happens when corporate power grows faster than democratic accountability, when sovereignty becomes negotiable, when nations become markets first and countries second. This isn't ancient history, it's the blueprint. And unless we recognize the pattern, we won't see it happening until it's already over, because the next United Fruit Company won't sell bananas. It'll sell data, energy, pharmaceuticals, whatever gives it leverage. And it'll use that leverage the same way to ensure governments serve profits, not people. History doesn't repeat, but incentives do. If this changed how you see corporate power, subscribe. Because the past isn't over, it's just rebranding.